In this episode, Faculty of Fine Arts Associate Professor Dr. Ann Dymond asks, what are museums for? Outside of their obvious function preserving and displaying cultural heritage, museums also functioned as political tools throughout history. In this talk, Dr. Dymond explores the mobilization of Canada's art and museums for political purposes, starting with the nation's engagement with China in the early 1970s. Join her and learn how, in troubled times, art and museums can act as bridges that connect us across challenging divides.
I got up the stairs in heels without tripping, so we're off to a great start. Oki, and hello, everyone. I would just add to that introduction that I've been lucky to be here in Blackfoot Confederacy territory for 25 years now. And I don't want to echo all of the thanks, but thanks to all the senior administrators who make this happen, to Terry Whitehead, Knut, and Dennis for supporting it, and to my dean, Heather Davis-Fish, for her work, as well as the comms and event team, including Kaylee, Monica, and Karin, and others who work behind the scenes. I also want to thank my friends at the GALT for tonight, but also for their steadfast support of our museum studies program. I'm just going to move this a little bit so I don't have to duck. I think that's good. Okay. Mostly, I want to thank all of you for sharing your time and attention with me tonight. And a special thanks to my husband, Philip Byrne, who's done so every night for close to 40 years now. Okay. And that is well-deserved because, I'm a lot. In 1973, Canada's then Department of External Affairs purchased this unremarkable house in Gravenhurst, Ontario, in order to turn it into a National Historic Site. It was unusual. It's an unusual way for a historic house museum to be created. It's not in scope for external relations, now foreign affairs, and it's unusual for other reasons too. National historic sites are reserved for places closely tied to people who've made a nationally significant impact on the history of Canada. Norman Bethune had lived here until he was only 2, and more significantly, who's Norman Bethune? That is to say, few Canadians had ever heard of him in 1970, and those who had most likely knew him as a communist. Hardly a likely candidate for commemoration in the middle of the Cold War. So why did the government create this house museum in honor of Bethune? Well, we usually think of museums and historic sites as neutral spaces where we might be entertained, educated, or cultured. But when we look more closely, museums are profoundly political spaces. From their beginnings in the 18th century, museums were tied to ideas of citizenship and national identity. The best known example is the Louvre. In the middle of the French Revolution, during the Terror, when the entire country was in so much turmoil that they had to invent the guillotine to streamline the execution process, it might be surprising that the revolutionary government put right at the top of the list of important undertakings the creation of a public museum. They nationalized property owned by churches, nobility, and the monarchy to create the museum, and it was to be an institution worthy of a free people, worthy of the democratic state itself, and belonging to all the citizens of France. That is to say, it was profoundly connected to the idea of democracy. It helped shape and define a new national identity while also creating a hierarchical scale of nations that placed cultures with art at the top of the pyramid. That history underpins much of my research and tonight's presentation, which considers the stories that museums and exhibitions tell and looks at how those stories can be mobilized. When Canada set out to define itself as a nation distinct from Britain, art exhibitions were a useful tool because in this worldview, you have to have significant art to be a significant nation. At the National Gallery, our preferred story centered on landscape art, especially by the Group of Seven and Tom Thompson. These artists were celebrated as rugged, homegrown landscape painters expressing uniquely Canadian values. Like any good story, that was, in part, myth-making, not least because their art was based on European traditions. Crucially, art by Indigenous people was not collected by Canada's National Gallery of Art at all. Indigenous arts were relegated to the Museum of History. The National Gallery thought it told the story of Canada, but it was the story only of a settler nation. And their preferred landscapes typically presented the land as empty, a resource waiting to be claimed by settlers. And as a slight aside about museum studies, I'll add that for more than 40 years now, museums have been working to correct this, and especially since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 2015 report, we've seen significant change. I have the stats, a whole other book about it. But in any case, and you'll see that clearly if you visit the exhibitions here at the Galt or other institutions in town. Okay, I just don't quite have this right, and I'm gonna spend a second making it righter so that I could stand up taller. Okay, better? Yeah, thanks. Okay. For our purposes tonight, though, I want us to think about the categories: Canadian, Indigenous, national, and the often unconscious associations that such constructed categories make, and the role that museums might play in that. The exclusion of Indigenous art implied that settler people made art and Indigenous people did not. It created and reinforced other kinds of unjust hierarchies. And I want to emphasize that to many of the people involved, these categories didn't feel political. They felt natural. In fact, they probably didn't think about them at all. They were, to the settlers at least, almost invisible. And that's when such categories are most powerful. Cultural diplomacy refers generally to an exchange of culture that's meant to foster increased understanding, strengthen relationships, or promote national interests. And it relies on the idea of soft power, influencing others not by force, but by other means. As with ideas of identity, influence is working best when it's almost invisible, when it seems utterly natural and unscripted. Basically, when you accept the terms of the engagement without even being conscious of it. One of the clearest examples of a soft power offensive comes from the United States in the 1950s and 60s. That country's mobilization of various forms of culture in what it characterized as a fight against communism is pretty clear. The slide shows Radio Free Europe, which was an openly anti-communist form of cultural engagement, at first covertly and then openly supported by the CIA. In terms of the visual arts, however, the US government was significantly more covert in its deployment of exhibitions as weapons of soft power. And here I'm going to do some really brief, broad art history. As background, broadly speaking, and art historian people and art people in the room don't complain about this. Before World War II, American art was dominated by realism, as shown in these two examples. But by the 1940s, that style often seemed old-fashioned. Moreover, realism was the preferred style of both communists and fascists, and it was much on view at the 1937 World's Fair in Paris, which is a whole thing. In the US, in the 1940s, abstraction came to represent the new, the modern, the dynamic. And crucially, it was the opposite of both Soviet state-sanctioned socialist realism and Hitler's fascist aesthetics. Abstract painting quickly became shorthand for freedom and individualism. The slide shows a 1949 Life magazine article asking, is Pollock the greatest living painter in the United States? And sorry for the spoiler, short answer is yes. By the late 1950s, the CIA, thank you for laughing at my jokes, I super appreciate it. I'm a little bit nervous, I don't know if you can tell. Okay, by the late 1950s, the CIA was covertly funding international art exhibitions of this kind of American abstraction. New York's Museum of Modern Art toured the exhibition, The New American Painting, which included work by Pollock and other artists from the New York School. We see a photo of a wall installation at the museum illustrating all the sites their international exhibitions had toured to, effectively planting the American flag around the globe. On the right are some quotations from the book that accompanied the exhibition, what we call an exhibition catalog, in which the museum promotes, quote, the uncompromising individualism of these artists as the strongest possible assertion of the principle of freedom which motivates our society. The catalog also, okay, this is just slipping down and down and down, and I'm going to go up again. The catalog also quotes from European reviews of the show when it gets reprinted in America, and where, as you see here, where abstraction was again read as evidence of the greater freedom that Americans enjoyed. That is to say, the cultural diplomacy was effective. The Europeans were buying what the Americans were selling, so to speak. They were seeing them in the way America wanted to be seen. Later, it came out that this was part of a deliberate Cold War strategy, a cultural weapon to counter leftist influence in Europe, and that one of the MoMA employees involved in these productions was also CIA. And okay, like as a bizarre aside, he also writes the memoir that becomes the basis of the TV show 8 is Enough. I've got nothing on that, but it is true. Okay, by now, I suspect you may be thinking, okay, but like when is she gonna get to the bras? Not yet. We have to go through the communists first. In the post-war period, Canada deliberately sought ways to separate its identity from both the United Kingdom and the United States. And supporting the growth of Canadian culture was central. Our Department of External Affairs created a culture division, which purchased art, created exhibitions, and sent them around the globe. But my research has taken me into China. So while the US was exporting abstract art as a symbol of freedom, Canada in 1973 created a national museum to a communist. How did we get there? Very briefly, Canada and many other Western nations, including the US, had no diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China after the newly communist nation was founded in 1949. By the mid-1960s, there was an increasing sense that ignoring this huge swath of territory with its sizable population was neither in Canada's best interests economically nor in global interests generally. And in 1970, Canada was one of the first Western countries to recognize the Communist People's Republic, and I show you a New York Times report on that event. It makes the front page, of course. And I show you here an image of our then, a very crappy image, I'm sorry, of our then Minister of External, thank you so much, I would really appreciate that. Okay, thank you. I show you here an image of our then Minister of External Affairs announcing this change at the United Nations, and I only included this photo because I thought it might resonate with some of the announcements of our Prime Minister at the UN this week. This made Canada a leader internationally. The diplomatic framework for recognition we crafted was used by other countries, and it was a high point in Canada's role on the international stage. And it happened almost 9 years before the US officially did the same. It stands to me as some evidence that we can be leaders on the international stage, even when it's not in line with our powerful neighbors. The Canadian and Chinese governments were eager to trade, and for many subsequent years we had a trade surplus with China, selling, for example, our fine prairie wheat to a country that desperately needed it. But the government also wanted to facilitate other kinds of exchange, including reciprocal art exhibitions. Canadian diplomats understood that cultural exchanges would be very delicate. It was the middle of the Cultural Revolution, a period that severely restricted what could be expressed or displayed in China. An exhibition of contemporary abstract paintings would have been outright rejected. But unlike the US, abstract art had never been the Canadian government's go-to for expressing its identity. So how did Canada, or what did it use to project itself abroad? perhaps surprisingly, I hope surprisingly, exhibitions of Inuit art. And the first one in China was jointly organized by then the Department of Northern Affairs and Natural Resources and the Department of External Affairs. Inuit art was then, and remains to some extent, an ideal vehicle for cultural diplomacy. In both prints and carvings, its characteristic blend of naturalism and abstraction, its focus on apolitical subjects, its use of pared-down forms that express essentials, make it feel both very modern and also universal. Even better for Canada's diplomacy, the Inuit have been here since time immemorial, and so their work and identity lent the young nation the illusion of a deep history that goes back beyond 1867. Since the early 1950s, Canada had been mobilizing Inuit art as one of two of its central planks in its foreign exhibitions. A major exhibition that I'll call Canadian Inuit Art, shown here, and created by the Department of Northern Affairs, was toured by External Affairs in the later 1950s, all through Western Europe, and its Inuit art was favorably compared to European modernists like Henry Moore. It was so successful that its tour was extended into Eastern Europe, deliberately into communist satellite states. The record make that very clear, that they're interested in reaching the communist satellite states. And then it went on to tour Southeast Asia, like this is in sort of the Vietnam War era. So it wasn't the same strategy that the CIA was using. It wasn't linked to ideas of freedom. Instead, it emphasized a nation that valued diversity as opposed to communalism. And it was also definitely part of the offensive against rising communist sentiment globally. To make sense of this, we have to know that the Canadian government was deeply involved in both the production and marketing of Inuit art. So while Inuit communities had long made art, the print tradition and the larger carving traditions, basically everything that you think of as Inuit art probably, like things that you see now as Inuit art, were actually introduced to the Inuit by the Canadian government after World War II as part of a series of federal programs that moved the people off the land and into settlements. That is to say, the Inuits did not make prints until the post-war period. These were part of a plan to foster a new northern economy, although another way I might say that would be that they were part of a plan of planned acculturation. Government agencies such as the Canadian Eskimo Arts Council then selected or rejected what art would be purchased and brought to the South. They guaranteed its authenticity, and they both promoted and toured Inuit art exhibitions in Canada. And I love that picture of whatever, like 10 white dudes looking at the art and deciding about it. But anyway, so both to emphasize, External Affairs toured it both to emphasize Canada as a northern nation and a benevolent multicultural state. And of course, now we see this as a kind of painful irony. This was during a period of aggressive attempts at acculturation of the Inuit people. But I just want to underline what's going on here. At a time when the National Gallery is not collecting art by any Indigenous people, the federal government is buying Inuit art and marketing it as a symbol of the nation. So, although the art itself appeared apolitical, its use was deeply political. And it was tied to Canada's sovereignty claims in the Arctic. In 1969, for example, a US tanker caused a diplomatic incident transiting the Northwest Passage and challenging Canada's claim that these were our sovereign waters. The Governor General, Vincent Massey, recalled after, in response, and I quote, "Canada needed to show our flag in the north, to make clear that this great region is the sovereign territory of Canada and not part of the land from those south of the border." And promoting Inuit art was one way that Canada chose to do that. That is to say, it's trying to make the Inuit seem like they have a close and good relationship with the Canadian government. Right? And this is, of course, our sovereign territory is another place where my talk touches on contemporary events, I think. Little record survives of the version of this exhibition that went to China, but it was considered a diplomatic success, not least because it didn't tick off the Chinese government, but also because it provided an event space for contact to occur. In terms of winning hearts and minds, this is always harder to assess, and a Canadian newspaper reported that audiences seemed basically perplexed by the surrealist quality of the Inuit prints. This, of course, makes the art historians twitch because they're not surrealist, but in any case. He went on to say some other weirder things, including that the visitors were mostly not that interested in the art, but they were very interested in a documentary that showed life in the North. He writes, the film made them sympathetic to its depiction of the difficulties of life in the North, which they compared to China's Mongolia. So the film showed life on the land before the movement to the cities, and so it also bolstered the sense of the benevolence of the government because they were making life easier for the Inuit, is the way the propaganda goes. Okay, so if Inuit art was the first exhibition Canada sent to its new diplomatic friend, what would the next be? The exhibition, The Canadian Landscape in Painting, featuring the Group of Seven. This one was not organized by External Affairs, although they were deeply involved. It was organized by the National Gallery of Canada, who worked closely with both Economic Affairs and the embassy in Beijing. This exhibition was especially delicate because it was the first exhibition of art in a European tradition that had been shown in China in many years. Normally, a government wouldn't intervene at the level of selecting artworks, and this was true on the Canadian side, but the Chinese government was granted a veto right of refusal. The gallery had to send photos of every painting in advance, and the PRC refused works by Lauren Harris and Emily Carr, whose work you see here, as well as the work of David Milne, among others. It's quite hard, actually, to see how these works were offensive, but what the rejected works share is that they're among the most abstracted works that were proposed. Again, the exhibition's promotional materials emphasize the diversity of Canada's people and its geography, and it suggests an attachment to the land as a key element in uniting Canadians. Canadian diplomats called the exhibition a success. Nevertheless, one review in China, undoubtedly vetted and approved by the Chinese government, took our national obsession with landscape painting in a direction that might surprise us. This semi-official response saw art as extremely political. They wrote, and so I have a bit of a long quote here, through paintings of natural scenery, we can see aspects of Canada's political and economic life. It is a country rich in resources. The founding of the country in 1867 led to the development of capitalism here. And, they say, the bourgeois class invested money and energy in exploring, and then paintings of that landscape helped the newly born country in its economic and cultural construction. This is not how Canadians write art history about our country, but in any case. So they criticized this work in particular for its too decorative working style and its departures from reality. But the article concluded, in spite of this, visitors to the gallery can still appreciate the scenery near the birthplace of Norman Bethune, a close friend of the Chinese people. End article. So, our diplomacy with China has been described as oscillating between an emphasis on promoting our economic interests and an emphasis on some moral position that implies we think we might be able to influence, for the good, the Chinese state. These first exhibitions seem pretty light on any attempts at moral suasion. These aren't Radio Free Europe. However, I want to read from a statement by a Chinese artist who saw the exhibition. He was a young man at the time. And the first two paragraphs here situate Bethune and emphasize the restrictions that they experienced in Canada. I'll start in the third paragraph. He writes, "I realized that because the paintings were landscapes with without political messages, they were allowed to be shown. However, as an artist, I discovered individual voices under the beautiful landscapes. The white, snowy mountains and the colorful autumn scenes stood foremost in my mind. These white mountains stood out from the red Chinese political landscapes. The group of 7 gave Chinese artists a very strong signal for individualism in art. This was my first impression of Canada. I dreamed to visit those white mountains." The artist, Gu Zhong, first came to Canada to do a residency in Alberta's Banff Centre and is now a professor at UBC. One problem studying cultural diplomacy is that its impacts are very difficult to assess, but I found this very moving. Where our governments sought to more overtly leverage culture for diplomatic means was in the formation of the Bethune House. We're not at the bras yet, which might be Canada's most effective soft power resource. So, in 1970, when talks with China began, Canadian diplomats quickly saw how useful Norman Bethune could be. Bethune was a Canadian thoracic surgeon. He visited the Soviet Union in 1935 and became a committed communist. In 1936, he went to fight fascism in Spain, where he set up the first mobile blood transfusion service. He returned to Canada and, amid reports of difficult behavior, he was a womanizer and a drinker, though he gained some renown both for advocating socialized medicine and for his significant medical inventions. In 1938, Bethune went to China to aid Mao's forces against imperialist Japan. He met Mao briefly, but died the following year, 1939, from an infection after an accidental cut during battlefield surgery. Mao himself wrote a short tribute in memory of Norman Bethune, and by the 1970s, it had become one of the Cultural Revolution's 3 constantly read articles, blasted from loudspeakers and taught in schools. In fact, many students had to memorize the entire article. By then, nearly every Chinese person knew Bethune, and most often he was their primary lens on Canada. So, External Affairs purchased the house in time to announce it before Prime Minister Trudeau's 1974 visit to China, and immediately turned it over to Parks Canada, who began the process of turning it into a museum. It was a manse, that is, a church minister's residence, and Norman's father had been the minister. The family moved away in 1892 when Norman was 2, and obviously by the 1970s there was nothing remaining of the Bethunes. Yet this undistinguished house was famous in China. Before the government bought it, reports describe Chinese visitors arriving unannounced to visit the bedroom where Norman was born, and it's still a focal point in the museum. The room was then occupied by by the then minister's teenage son, who apparently wasn't thrilled with the attention. And I think we have to imagine it with like a Farrah Fawcett in the red bathing suit 70s poster, and the Chinese, the dates might be a little off there. Anyways, before the government bought it, reports describe, from the start, the museum faced a dilemma: how to represent a difficult personality with an openly communist politics in small-town Ontario. The founding documents show real discomfort, but as is appropriate for museums, after the initial political founding, the federal government had no more direct involvement. The historians working for Parks Canada were able to write a balanced, factual account, attending to the needs of their many Chinese visitors, as well as Canadian understandings of Bethune's life and contribution. The success of this institution as a form of cultural engagement is remarkable. The museum gets both official and anonymous gifts, more than it can store or display, even though it has a vault for them and a large purpose-built exhibition room for such tributes. And the visitor comments are remarkable too. There isn't time, but maybe in the questions someone can ask about my actual experience there and visitors. It also includes some fun interactives where, for example, you can put yourself into Bethune's mobile surgery team. So, what does China send us? What's their agenda? The idea of reciprocity is central to this kind of diplomacy, and our exhibitions were tiny compared to the two major exhibitions the PRC sent out to both European and North American sites. The catchily titled Exhibition of Archaeological Finds of the People's Republic of China opened at Toronto's Royal Ontario Museum after stops in Europe and before traveling on to the US. It showcased objects excavated since the founding of the Communist Republic, and really, that was the main purpose. It was to promote the idea that communist China was capable of rigorous scholarship, and also to counter the idea and promote the idea that they valued their own cultural heritage. But as we'll see, that was framed within Mao's dictum, let the past serve the present. Unlike Western art historical narratives that often celebrate elite patrons, this exhibition insisted that it was slaves and workers, not rulers, who created China's civilization. And instead of dividing the history into the traditional Chinese dynasty, it used stages instead, primitive, slave, and feudal. This construction positioned the communist state as the logical endpoint of a progressive ideology. The second exhibition has better graphics. Peasant paintings from Hugh County opened at the National Gallery in 1978. The content of this art exhibition was the most overtly propagandistic that we'll see tonight, or like perhaps ever. During the Cultural Revolution, and that's the same images was on the title wall of the exhibition. During the Cultural Revolution, traditional Chinese art, especially landscape painting, was denounced as one of the four olds and was supposed to be replaced by art directly emerging from the people. And like in practice, trained painters were sent out to the countryside, but that was really downplayed. And these kinds of paintings made into posters were seen as the creations of untrained peasants. I don't know if you've ever gone to like a paint and sip, but like making a work this complicated with no training is like quite difficult. So in any case, these works acted as a direct refutation of the notion that art was the preserve of elites and stood instead as evidence of the success of communism. The paintings show highly staged visions of socialist harmony, farmers and others happily working, studying, and prospering under the party leadership. And quite often, if you can't tell that that's what they're doing, they tell you in text on the slides, although not in the images I included. Canadian critics were divided. Robert Fulford called it crude propaganda and faulted the National Gallery for exhibiting works that lacked individual genius, while left-wing critic Barry Lord praised it as part of a global people's art movement that challenged Western individualism. But audiences loved it. These 5 exhibitions that I've been discussing were from a time when the direct intervention of government seemed more acceptable than today. But since the 1980s, federally led projects have declined, and that's true globally, more or less. And many argue that cultural relations are in fact best facilitated without government intervention, that non-state actors can facilitate more authentic cultural encounters, and that our understanding of cultural diplomacy should come to include a much broader consideration of the role of non-state actors. And now you must really be wondering when she's going to get to the bras. And I might forgive you for thinking that Madonna's not the only one who's a bit of a tease. Because we're not there yet, people. The Montreal Museum of Fine Arts provides a striking example. Between 2006 and 2018, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts produced 22 internationally touring shows, which is just like a mind-blowing amount. And 2/3 of those shows were completely or primarily European in content, as with the Napoleon exhibition I'm showing you here. Even more surprising to me, since 2007, none of those exhibitions featured any Quebecois content or Canadian content. So the museum is like deliberately emphasizing Quebec and Montreal's ties to Europe and the French-speaking world. But interestingly, the Montreal Museum also tours those shows to the US, promoting themselves implicitly as akin to Europe, but a lot closer maybe. And the US is in fact Quebec's biggest trading partner. And they actually toured more shows featuring US artists to Europe than they did Canadian. Okay, we got there, people. Their most successful international exhibition was this one, The Fashion World of Jean-Paul Gaultier. And I know we have some people in Gaultier tonight here with us, so that maybe we can get them to parade later. So the Gaultier show traveled to 11 international sites, and like every review started by talking about Gaultier as the enfant terrible of French fashion. And some of them mentioned like he was a French frog and things like that. His Frenchness was underlined at every turn. Response to the exhibition often linked Montreal and Paris and positioned the city as a global player. Funding came from the city and the province, but they weren't the impetus or involved in the content. So the museum's creating exhibitions that cast the city as progressive, fashion-forward, and global. But this exhibition served another purpose too. Reviews everywhere noted Gaultier's nonconformism, his clothes refusing gender binaries, and his fashion announcing a new freedom for women's bodies, supposedly. I'm skeptical, but okay. So when the exhibition traveled to South Korea in 2018, I think, complete with his take on the traditional Korean Donbok, the explanation in the press was a little broad. One quote I found said this, with great irony, Gaultier successfully changed the perception of traditional female underwear from oppressive garments associated with women's inferior social status to a symbol of the strong modern women. And many of the reviews of the show mention feminism. None that I've found so far mention gender fluidity. A component of this exhibition, which then was pulled out and traveled separately, and I'm showing you a picture from that, showcased Gaultier's wedding clothes designed for all genders. In places like South Korea, where gay marriage isn't yet recognized and LGBTQ rights are severely restricted, an exhibition like this does have impacts. And it's a clear case to me where a government-led initiative of exporting our values would be much less effective. A colleague from the MMFA who was at the opening told me that the normally hidden queer South Korean community was out in force at the Gaultier exhibition, and that a spirit of liberation was utterly joyous. So, as I move towards a conclusion, I've looked at art and other museums and their use by both democratic and undemocratic states. One of the most important strengths of museums in democratic countries is that, like universities, they are arm's length from the governments that often support them, even though sometimes those arms feel like teeny tiny Tyrannosaurus arms. They often provide direction, but the specifics of the interpretation are left to those without ideological axes or the short-term needs of getting reelected. In the past, this has allowed museums to be trusted educators and essentially apolitical. And although for lots of other reasons I was no fan of the Gaultier show, in fact, I've come to recognize that its cross-cultural success, especially in many countries where queer rights are non-existent or under threat, was a kind of outreach that really only cultural institutions can do. I started in this research with a basic distrust of cultural diplomacy, of governments mobilizing art to propagandize abstract ideas like freedom without necessarily caring about that concept, but weaponizing it politically. Indeed, we see the dangers of that kind of direct intervention around us all the time. But even in my cynicism, I've come to have some sympathy for a less government-led kind of cultural exchange that might actually change hearts and minds, or at least give people glimpses of other ways of thinking and being, giving the hope of other possible lives in ways that might lead to better understanding and more kindness, something we sorely need right now. And when I look around this beautiful province, I think that the Gautier show would look great right here in Alberta. Thank you.
In the next episode, Economics Associate Professor Dr. Danny Leroy explores how economic science can help guide the decision-making of agri-food producers.